The ultimate sacrifice. Mad scientist faces monstrous creation in final showdown. Chapter 1. The grief of a mad genius. The sky hung low, shrouded in a blanket of gray clouds as Dr. Victor Green stood motionless before the grave of his beloved wife, Anna. The world around him felt distant, muffled, like he was submerged beneath a cold, still ocean. The bitter wind whipped through the barren trees, but he did not flinch. His eyes, hollowed by sleepless nights, were fixed on the headstone that bore her name, Anna Green, beloved wife and devoted companion. Every syllable carved into the stone seemed to cut through his chest like a blade. His mind, once a place of brilliance and rationality, now swirled with confusion, grief, and desperation. For as long as he could remember, Victor had been guided by the principles of science. He had been a man of reason, one who sought answers in logic and method, whose life was defined by the pursuit of knowledge. But all that had changed the moment Anna's life was claimed by the merciless hand of fate. Her sudden illness had taken her from him in a matter of weeks, leaving him powerless despite all his knowledge. Science, for the first time in his life, had failed him. His grief was not the quiet kind, the type that left men to slowly heal in time. No, it gnawed at him relentlessly, eating away at the fabric of his sanity. He could feel it, an emptiness in his chest, a hollow sensation where his heart had once beat alongside hers. The world without Anna was a cruel mockery of the one he had known, a world in which everything he had built seemed meaningless. As he stood there, the cold earth beneath his feet, Victor's thoughts turned dark. How could this be the end? How could all that they had shared, all that she had been, simply cease to exist? It was not just her body that had been laid to rest. It was her spirit, her laughter, her warmth. In that moment, as he stood alone in the cemetery, Victor knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could not accept this. Death, he realized, was not an immutable law of nature. It was a puzzle yet to be solved. Over the weeks that followed Anna's burial, Victor threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on mania. The once methodical scientist now teetered on the edge of obsession. His laboratory, which had once been a place of innovation and discovery, was now a sanctuary of madness. Books lay strewn across the floor, papers piled high in disarray, equations scrawled hastily on the walls like the fevered ravings of a man possessed. Sleep became a distant memory, food a trivial necessity. His sole focus now was on one thing, bringing her back. Victor's mind, once a fortress of logic, had begun to decay, consumed by an unrelenting desire to defy the very nature of life and death. He no longer cared about the boundaries of science, the limits that had once kept his work in check. What were ethical codes and moral guidelines in the face of such a loss? Nothing, he told himself. Nothing mattered now, except finding a way to resurrect Anna. It started innocently enough. Victor had always been on the cutting edge of biochemical research, particularly in the field of cellular regeneration. His work, though groundbreaking, had never strayed beyond the boundaries of accepted science. But Anna's death had pushed him beyond those limits. He began to delve into more dangerous and uncharted territories. Research papers on necrobiology, ancient texts on alchemy, whispers of forbidden knowledge that should have remained hidden. As the days blurred into nights, Victor isolated himself further. His colleagues, once confidants, now seemed irrelevant to his cause. Even Jonathan Blake, his closest friend and collaborator, became a stranger. Jonathan had been concerned from the start. He had seen the way grief had hollowed Victor out, the way it had poisoned his once clear mind. Jonathan had tried to intervene, tried to pull Victor back from the brink, but his efforts had been met with cold indifference. "Victor, this is madness," Jonathan had warned during one of his rare visits to the lab. "I understand that you're hurting, but you can't go down this path. What you're suggesting—" "I know exactly what I'm suggesting, Jonathan," Victor had interrupted, his voice devoid of warmth. "And I know you don't understand. But I'm close, closer than anyone has ever been." Jonathan had shaken his head, his face a mask of worry. "Some things are not meant to be tampered with, Victor. You're risking everything, your career, your life. Anna wouldn't want this." Victor's gaze had hardened at the mention of her name. "Anna is all that matters. I'll bring her back, Jonathan. I'll make sure of it." That conversation had been weeks ago, and since then, Victor had cut off all contact with the outside world. He no longer cared for the opinions of his peers, the laws of society, or even the boundaries of nature itself. His laboratory became his prison, but it was a prison of his own making, a place where he could chase the impossible dream of undoing death. Every night, he dreamed of Anna. In his dreams, she stood before him, alive and radiant, her smile soft and warm like it had always been. But when he reached out to touch her, she would fade away like mist in the wind, leaving him alone in the darkness once more. Those dreams only fueled his obsession, driving him further into his research. Victor began to gather materials, some legal, others not. He procured a cadaver for his initial trials, a nameless body obtained through questionable channels. In his mind, it was a necessary sacrifice, a small price to pay for what would ultimately be the greatest scientific breakthrough in human history. He told himself that this was for Anna, that her return would justify any means. After all, who wouldn't want to bring back the ones they loved? Late one night, as Victor sat in the dim glow of his laboratory, the final pieces of his plan began to fall into place. His hands trembled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration as he assembled the intricate machinery that would become his resurrection apparatus. It was a grotesque fusion of technology and ancient knowledge, a testament to the lengths he was willing to go. His eyes, red-rimmed from exhaustion, darted between his notes and the lifeless body on the operating table before him. He was ready. He could feel it in his bones. The answer to death was within his grasp. As the last wire was connected and the hum of electricity filled the air, Victor stood over the body and whispered, "Anna, I will see you again." For the first time in weeks, a smile crept across his lips. But it was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a man who had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Chapter 2: The Forbidden Experiment begins. The underground laboratory, nestled beneath layers of stone and steel, hummed with a quiet, unsettling energy. Victor Green stood at the center of the room, staring down at the body that lay cold and still on the operating table. The dim light cast long shadows across the space, giving the lab an eerie, otherworldly glow. Everything was in place now. The intricate machinery, the arcane symbols scrawled across the floor in a mix of chalk and blood, the beakers of strange, shimmering fluids. This was no ordinary laboratory anymore. It had become a temple to the dark union of science and the forbidden. The body before him was that of Alice, a homeless woman whose death had gone unnoticed by the world above. She had lived and died in the shadows, forgotten and nameless, her final breaths lost in the city's indifferent streets. But to Victor, she was more than a casualty of society. She was his key, his first step toward something monumental. It hadn't been difficult to obtain her body. No family had come forward to claim her, and her unmarked grave had provided him the perfect opportunity to retrieve her undisturbed. It was grim work, but necessary. He had convinced himself that she would have wanted this, a second chance at life, even if she hadn't known it. Victor's hands trembled as he adjusted the apparatus surrounding Alice's lifeless form. The machinery, a chaotic assembly of wires, electrodes, and mysterious vials, represented his life's work. A twisted marriage of technology and esoteric practices, theories of cellular regeneration spliced with ancient texts on alchemy. It was a grotesque parody of progress, and yet, in Victor's fevered mind, it was brilliance. He had gone far beyond the bounds of conventional science, far past the point of no return. There was no room left for doubt. He paused for a moment, his breath shallow, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the machinery around him. The steady hum filled the room, almost soothing in its mechanical precision. But beneath that, there was something else, a subtle wrongness, a faint vibration that felt like it came from the very earth itself. The symbols he had drawn on the floor flickered in and out of view, as though the energy coursing through the lab was disturbing the air around them. "This is it," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from days of isolation and obsessive work. "This is the beginning." With shaking fingers, Victor reached for a syringe filled with a glowing iridescent liquid, his own concoction, a formula he had developed through endless experimentation. It was a fusion of biochemistry and the dark arts, a substance that was as much alchemical as it was scientific. He injected it into Alice's veins, watching as the fluid coursed through her body, a faint glow tracing the path beneath her pale skin. The sight filled him with a strange exhilaration, as though he were on the cusp of a discovery that would change the world. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat as the machinery began to whir louder, the lights flickering with a growing intensity. The air in the lab seemed to thicken, charged with something unnatural. Victor's heart pounded in his chest, the anticipation mounting with each passing second. He had calculated every variable, accounted for every possible outcome, or so he thought. But as the experiment reached its climax, a creeping sensation began to settle in the pit of his stomach. The strange vibration he had felt earlier intensified, becoming a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to resonate through the walls. The symbols on the floor pulsed in time with the hum, and for the first time, Victor hesitated. He could feel it now. Something was off. He had controlled every aspect of the experiment, but there was an element, an unseen force, that he could not explain, something ancient and beyond his understanding. Shaking his head, he dismissed the thought. It was just his nerves, the strain of the weeks spent in isolation and grief. He had come too far to stop now. There was no turning back. Victor flipped the final switch, sending a surge of electricity through Alice's body. Her limbs jerked violently as the current coursed through her, and for a brief moment, the lab was bathed in a blinding light. The machinery screamed, the wires crackling with energy, and then silence. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Victor stood frozen, his eyes locked on the motionless form before him. Had he failed? Had all his work, all his sacrifices been for nothing? His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. Then a sound, a faint gasp, barely audible in the quiet of the lab. Victor's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened as he watched Alice's chest rise and fall, her lungs drawing in air for the first time in death. Her fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttering as though struggling to open. She was alive. For a moment, Victor was overcome with a sense of triumph. He had done it. He had defied nature, beaten death itself. He had brought her back. But as he stepped closer, his triumph quickly turned to dread. Something was wrong. Alice's eyes snapped open, but the gaze that met his was not human. Her pupils were dilated, the whites of her eyes tinged with a sickly yellow glow. Her expression was vacant, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. She stared at Victor, unblinking, but there was no recognition in her gaze, no trace of the woman she had once been. "Can you hear me?" Victor whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Alice's mouth twitched, a grotesque imitation of a smile, and for a moment, it looked as though she might respond. But instead, a low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound that sent chills down Victor's spine. Her body convulsed, twisting in unnatural ways as she tried to sit up, her limbs moving with a disturbing lack of coordination. Victor backed away, his mind racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't what he had intended. He had brought her back, yes, but what had he really brought back? The body before him was alive, but it was clear that whatever made Alice human, her soul, her mind, her essence, was gone. In its place was something else, something other. As Alice's movements became more erratic, the hum in the lab grew louder, vibrating through the walls and the floor. The symbols drawn on the ground flickered violently, almost as if they were trying to contain some force that was now pushing against their boundaries. Victor's hands trembled as he realized the full extent of what he had done. He hadn't just brought a body back to life. He had opened a door, and something had come through. Just then, a loud knock echoed from the entrance to the lab. Victor's heart leaped in his chest. Jonathan. He must have followed his suspicions, come to confront him once more. Panic surged through Victor's veins. He couldn't let Jonathan see this. Not now. Not when everything had spiraled so far beyond his control. Alice let out another low growl, her body lurching off the table with a sudden, violent motion. Victor's breath quickened, his mind racing for a solution. He had to contain her, had to stop this before it got any worse. But even as he reached for the nearest restraint, he knew, deep down, that it was already too late. Chapter 3: The Monstrous Awakening. The air in the laboratory grew heavier with each passing second, as if the very walls were absorbing the dark energy emanating from Alice's unnatural resurrection. Her movements were jerky, as though her body struggled to remember how to be human. Yet, her presence in the room stirred something far more sinister, as though her return had disrupted a delicate balance between life and death. Victor stood frozen, his mind swirling with a mixture of awe and fear. He had achieved what no one thought possible. He had bridged the gap between the living and the dead. But as Alice moved, her eyes scanning the room with a lifeless, vacant stare, the chilling realization began to dawn on him. This was not the Alice he had expected, not the woman whose spirit had once inhabited that body. Something else had taken her place, something that should never have been awakened. Alice's head snapped toward the corner of the room where a row of potted plants sat on a shelf. Victor had kept them in the lab to study cellular growth, but now they served a different purpose. As Alice drew near, the vibrant leaves curled in on themselves, turning brown and brittle before crumbling to dust. It was as if her mere presence was sucking the life out of everything around her. Victor's heart raced, pounding in his chest. His earlier euphoria, the thrill of scientific triumph, now felt like a distant memory. What had he done? He backed away, eyes wide with terror, as he watched the once lifeless woman shuffle toward the plants, oblivious to the destruction she left in her wake. The laboratory, once a haven for his intellectual pursuits, now felt like a trap. The machines that had hummed so obediently minutes earlier flickered and sputtered, some of the lights dimming without explanation. A sudden, high-pitched whine came from one of the computers as sparks flew from its terminal. Screens blinked on and off, displaying strange, indecipherable symbols before fizzling out completely. Victor stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a tray of instruments. He had read about this. Occultists had warned about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond comprehension. The ancient texts he had consulted spoke of entities, not souls, that would rush to fill the void left behind by death. They were not bound by the same rules as the living, and their existence could warp reality itself. The laboratory door burst open with a loud crash, and Jonathan Blake stormed in, his face flushed with anger and concern. He had clearly grown tired of waiting for answers. "Victor, what in God's name are you doing down here?" Jonathan's voice rang out, sharp and demanding, but there was a tremor of unease beneath his words. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His eyes flickered between Alice and Jonathan, panic flooding his mind. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, noticing the erratic behavior of the machines, the withered plants, and finally Alice, her disjointed, unnatural movements. What have you done?" Jonathan's voice cracked as he took a step closer to the scene, disbelief etched into his features. He looked at Alice with growing horror, understanding dawning on him slowly but surely. Victor's mind raced, scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't sound like madness, but before he could speak, Alice turned toward Jonathan. Her expressionless face contorted for a brief moment, as though something deep within her was trying to break through, but then her gaze locked on Jonathan with a predatory focus. Jonathan, sensing the danger too late, backed away slowly. "Victor, this isn't right. Whatever you've done, we need to stop it. Now." But it was too late. Alice lunged forward with terrifying speed, her hand grasping at the air in front of her as if she could already feel Jonathan's heartbeat beneath his skin. Victor watched, paralyzed, as Jonathan stumbled backward, his hand outstretched in a futile attempt to keep her at bay. Before Jonathan could shout a warning, one of Victor's lab assistants, Robert, rushed in from the side, reacting instinctively to the threat. "Get back!" he yelled, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. He grabbed a metal rod from a nearby table and swung it toward Alice, hoping to knock her away from Jonathan. But Alice moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Her hand lashed out, and before Robert could land the blow, she gripped his arm with an inhuman strength. His scream echoed through the lab as his body convulsed, his skin turning pale in seconds. Victor and Jonathan watched in horror as Robert's life drained from him, his eyes rolling back into his head as he collapsed, lifeless, to the floor. Victor gasped, the realization striking him with brutal clarity. This was no longer a simple resurrection. Alice had become a conduit for something far worse. Whatever force had taken root in her was far beyond anything Victor could control. Jonathan stared in shock at Robert's lifeless form. "You've unleashed something. Something terrible," he shouted, his voice trembling as he turned to Victor. "This isn't science, Victor. This is madness." Victor's mind was spinning, thoughts colliding in his head with frantic speed. He had known the risks, had seen the warnings hidden in the texts, but he had been so blinded by his grief and obsession that he had ignored them all. Now it was too late to undo what had been set in motion. His creation had slipped beyond the boundaries of his control, and the consequences were already spiraling out of control. Alice stood over Robert's lifeless body, her head twitching unnaturally, as though she were trying to process the scene around her. Her hands clenched and unclenched, the muscles in her body moving with a mechanical precision that sent shivers down Victor's spine. She was alive, but she was no longer human. She was something else, something wrong, and her very existence warped the space around her. Jonathan turned to Victor, fury and fear mingling in his eyes. "We have to stop her now before anyone else dies." He took a step toward Victor, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him. "You have to fix this." Victor, trembling, nodded, but deep down, he knew. There was no fixing this. Alice was no longer a person. She was a vessel for something beyond human understanding, and that presence, whatever it was, had plans of its own. Suddenly, the lab's lights flickered violently, casting the room into intermittent darkness. In those brief moments of blackness, Alice's figure seemed to blur, almost as if she was not entirely bound to the physical world. And with each flash, the space seemed to shift around her. Objects moved, shadows danced unnaturally, and the air itself seemed to bend. Without warning, Alice turned and bolted toward the door, her movements unnervingly swift and animalistic. Jonathan lunged after her, but she was too fast. She slipped out of the lab and into the cold night beyond, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. The sound of breaking glass and bending metal echoed through the lab as the chaos of her escape reverberated. Victor collapsed into a nearby chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table for support. His breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. Jonathan, still catching his breath, turned to him with a look of horror. "She's loose," Jonathan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell have you done, Victor?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, the distant sounds of the night seemed too still, too quiet. Alice was out there now, and Victor knew that whatever had been set loose would not stop until it had claimed far more than just Robert. And as the night closed in, Victor was forced to confront the terrifying truth. He had opened a door that should have remained shut, and now, the nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 4: The Terror Spreads. The sun was barely visible through a thick layer of fog, casting a gloomy shadow over the small town that nestled just beyond the lab. What had begun as a minor ripple of unease soon evolved into a tidal wave of dread. It started with whispers, rumors of odd occurrences, strange noises, and the sudden death of animals. Then came the human casualties. Victor sat hunched over his desk, the dim light from a single lamp illuminating the stacks of papers and books spread out before him. He had been up for days, scouring over every piece of information he could find on resurrection, dark rituals, and the forces that governed life and death. Sleep eluded him, driven away by both guilt and the pressing fear of what Alice had become. His mind replayed the events over and over. Robert's lifeless body, Alice's unnatural escape, Jonathan's horrified expression. It was all too much. But what haunted him most was the knowledge that Alice was still out there, changing, evolving into something far beyond his understanding. He had been chasing the unattainable, and now he had unleashed a nightmare upon the world. Victor's phone buzzed loudly on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it with trembling hands, dreading the call he knew was coming. Sheriff Henry, a grizzled veteran of the town, was on the other end. His voice was stern, but there was an edge of fear that hadn't been there before. "Victor, we need to talk. I've got bodies piling up, and none of them make sense." Henry's tone left no room for ambiguity. 3 people in the last 2 days, all of them found in the same condition as your assistant. Victor swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Henry's voice dropped to a near whisper, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. "Drained, like something sucked the life right out of them. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone." The pit in Victor's stomach deepened. He clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. He started, but hesitated, knowing the full weight of his admission. "I'll come to the station. We need to discuss this in person." As Victor ended the call, the realization that the authorities were now involved made his heart race. He had hoped to contain this, to find Alice before things spiraled too far. But now it was too late. The experiment, his experiment, had slipped far beyond his control. He wasn't just facing a scientific failure, he was responsible for the deaths of innocent people. Pulling on a jacket, he prepared to leave, but his mind was already racing ahead. Where was Alice now? What had she become, and how far was she willing to go? He had to find her, before anyone else paid the price for his hubris. Meanwhile, Jonathan Blake sat in his own office, surrounded by pages of research. Unlike Victor, his approach had been more methodical. After their last encounter, he had begun to dig into the ancient texts and forbidden knowledge Victor had used. The more he uncovered, the more horrified he became. Jonathan had known Victor was brilliant, but this was no longer science. It was a flirtation with forces that should never have been touched. Hidden between the lines of Victor's research were warnings, dark and ominous, about crossing the boundary between life and death. The experiments Victor had drawn from were not merely theoretical. They came with a heavy cost, and the consequences were now unraveling in terrifying ways. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jonathan opened it to find Dr. Evelyn Warren, a colleague who had grown concerned by the strange happenings. She had seen the news reports about the deaths in town and had heard whispers about Victor's secretive work. "You're looking into Green's experiments, aren't you?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Jonathan nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's worse than I thought. He's opened a door that can't be closed, and now the consequences are spilling out into the world." Evelyn glanced over the scattered notes on his desk. "What do you mean?" "I've been reading the same texts Victor did. These aren't just old myths or pseudoscience. They contain knowledge, dangerous knowledge, about manipulating the forces of life itself. Victor was obsessed with finding a way to reverse death, but he ignored the warnings. Now Alice, she's not just a revived body, she's something else entirely." Evelyn's eyes widened in shock. "You think she's responsible for the deaths?" Jonathan sighed heavily. "I don't think. I know. Whatever Victor did, it's unleashed something far worse than any of us could have imagined. Alice is evolving, becoming something unnatural. And the deaths we're seeing, they're just the beginning." Evelyn sat down, processing the gravity of what Jonathan was saying. "We have to stop her. But how? If she's already changing, what chance do we have?" "I don't know," Jonathan admitted. "But I have a feeling that Victor is the only one who can end this, if it's even possible." In the heart of the town, strange occurrences continued to escalate. Streetlights flickered as though plagued by an unseen force, casting eerie shadows over the deserted streets. People stayed indoors, locking their windows and doors, sensing that something dark had taken root in their once peaceful community. Sheriff Henry, overwhelmed with reports of oddities and the recent deaths, assembled a small team to investigate the areas near the lab. They approached cautiously, knowing that whatever they were dealing with was beyond their comprehension. But none of them were prepared for what awaited them. As they reached the outskirts of the lab's perimeter, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. The hair on the back of their necks stood up as if some invisible force was watching them, waiting. They called out, but no response came from the empty buildings. Just as Henry was about to signal his team to move forward, a figure appeared in the distance. It was Alice. But she was no longer the woman they expected. Her body had mutated, her skin pale and stretched taut over her bones, her movements no longer human. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, filled with an unearthly hunger. Henry's men froze in place, their instincts screaming at them to run, but curiosity and duty held them in place. Suddenly, Alice moved, faster than any human should have been able to. In the blink of an eye, she was upon them. Her touch brought death, one by one, draining their life force as effortlessly as breathing. The men screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the night as they fell to the ground, lifeless and hollow. Henry, barely managing to escape, stumbled back toward his vehicle, gasping for air. He had witnessed something beyond explanation, something that defied everything he knew. His hands shook as he fumbled for his radio, calling for backup. But deep down, he knew reinforcements wouldn't make a difference. Alice had become a living nightmare, and no amount of law or order could stop her. Hours later, Victor returned to his lab, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to stop what he had unleashed. He hadn't expected Alice to evolve so quickly, nor had he imagined the scale of destruction she was capable of. The town was falling into chaos, and it was his fault. As he entered the lab, a chilling sense of dread settled over him. The place was quiet, too quiet. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, remnants of Alice's earlier escape. The air was thick with tension, and Victor knew she would return. She had to. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching from the shadows. Alice had returned. But this time she wasn't seeking help. She was seeking revenge. Victor's heart pounded as he backed away from the door, knowing that he was now face to face with the very thing he had created, a being that no longer bore any trace of humanity. And as the darkness closed in around him, he realized with a sinking dread that he might not survive to undo his mistake. Chapter 5: The Collapse of the Rational Mind. Victor sat in the dim glow of his office, the lab's machinery humming softly around him. The room felt smaller than it ever had, as if the walls were closing in, suffocating him under the weight of his catastrophic failure. His hands trembled as they hovered over his notes, once the essence of his life's work, now a reminder of the horrors he had unleashed. The equations, theories, and data meant nothing in the face of Alice's unnatural evolution. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his vision blurred, not from exhaustion, but from the rapid decay of his sanity. For the first time in his life, science, his steadfast beacon, had failed him. No formula could explain how Alice had transcended death and become something beyond comprehension. It defied every law of biology, every principle of physics, and left him stranded in the unknown. He reached for a flask of whiskey sitting on the cluttered desk, his hands shaking so violently that the liquid splashed out onto the papers. Victor swallowed hard, feeling the burn of the alcohol, but it did little to dull the rising panic that gnawed at his mind. How did this happen? He muttered to himself, his voice cracking. What went wrong? Images of Alice, her twisted form looming in the shadows, flashed through his mind. She was no longer human, no longer the woman he had intended to bring back. In his obsession to conquer death, he had unknowingly opened a door to something far worse, something he could never fully understand. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming jarred him from his spiraling thoughts. Jonathan burst into the room, his face pale and drawn, his usual calm demeanor replaced by uncharacteristic urgency. "Victor, we don't have time for this." Jonathan's voice was hoarse, and his eyes burned with intensity. "She's out there, and it's getting worse. People are dying faster than the authorities can contain. This quarantine won't hold for long, and neither will the town." Victor glanced up at him, his eyes hollow and sunken, a haunted expression etched across his features. I can't understand it," Victor whispered, as if his mind was unraveling even as he spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Jonathan shook his head, frustration and fear mingling in his tone. "You need to stop thinking like a scientist. This isn't just some experiment gone wrong. Alice isn't a subject anymore. She's something far beyond us." Victor stared blankly at the cluttered desk, refusing to meet Jonathan's gaze. He had always prided himself on his logic, his unwavering commitment to reason. But now, reason had abandoned him, leaving behind a yawning chasm of madness. The laws of nature no longer applied. Every calculation, every hypothesis had crumbled beneath the sheer impossibility of Alice's existence. "Do you even understand what she's become?" Jonathan demanded, stepping closer. "She's not just a body brought back to life. She's transcended death in ways we can't fathom. The longer she exists, the stronger she grows, and we've barely scratched the surface of what she can do." Victor shuddered, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with crushing force. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could bring her back." Jonathan paced the room, his agitation mounting. "It's too late for that now. Whatever you intended, it's long gone. She's out there, Victor. People are dying, and soon it won't just be this town. If she keeps evolving like this, there's no telling what she'll do next." Victor's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse echoing in his ears. He had lost control of Alice, of the experiment, of his mind. His vision swam, and he gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. For a fleeting moment, he had felt the thrill of success, the euphoria of playing God. Now, all that remained was the crushing realization that he had created a monster, a being who had no place in the world of the living. What do we do? Victor's voice was desperate now, his hands twitching at his sides. Jonathan stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto Victor with grim determination. There's only one thing left to do, he said quietly. We have to destroy her, completely, before she destroys everything. Victor recoiled at the suggestion, his mind racing. Destroy her? He repeated as if the words were incomprehensible. But she's alive. She's not Alice anymore, Victor. Jonathan snapped, his voice rising. That woman is gone. What's out there is something else, something dangerous. If we don't act now, more people are going to die. Victor's throat tightened, his chest constricting painfully. Destroy her? After everything he had done to bring her back? He had been so close to achieving the impossible, to unlocking the secrets of life and death. But now, standing on the precipice of his greatest discovery, he realized with chilling clarity that he had ventured into realms no man should tread. Jonathan saw the hesitation in Victor's eyes and softened his tone. I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you didn't mean for it to end like this. But if you don't help me stop her, more people will suffer. You know I'm right. Victor slumped back into his chair, his mind a tangle of conflicting emotions. He had thought he could fix it, that he could somehow find a way to reverse the horror he had created. But there was no going back. Alice had become something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined, and now the only choice left was to end it. With a heavy sigh, he nodded, his face pale and drawn. You're right, he muttered, defeated. We have to stop her. Jonathan's expression was grim, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. Then we need to figure out how. She's not human anymore. Bullets, weapons, they won't work. We need to find a way to destroy her completely. Victor rubbed his temples, his mind reeling. The thought of killing Alice, of undoing everything he had worked for, filled him with dread. But he knew Jonathan was right. There was no other option. She's drawn to the lab, Victor murmured, his voice distant. It's where she was created, where it all began. If we can lure her back here, we might have a chance. Jonathan nodded, his face set with determination. Then we'll set a trap. We'll use whatever we can to end this. Victor swallowed hard, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. But if we fail? We won't, Jonathan interrupted, his voice firm. We can't afford to fail. As the two men began to formulate their desperate plan, the world outside continued to crumble. The town had been placed under strict quarantine, with armed forces patrolling the streets, but nothing could stop the spread of panic. Reports of strange deaths and unexplained phenomena filled the airwaves, and the once quiet town had descended into chaos. No one could explain what was happening, but the people could feel it, a dark presence looming over them, growing stronger with each passing moment. Victor's mind teetered on the edge of collapse as he prepared for what lay ahead. He had spent his life pushing the boundaries of science, but now those boundaries had shattered, leaving him stranded in a nightmare of his own making. Logic and reason had failed him, and all that remained was a growing sense of madness. And somewhere in the darkness, Alice was waiting, evolving, changing, becoming something no one could ever stop. Chapter 6: The Price of Playing God. The lab was unrecognizable. Twisted metal jutted out at odd angles, the walls warped as if reality itself had buckled under the strain of Alice's presence. The once orderly space now felt like a battlefield between worlds, caught in the throes of something that defied all reason. Every breath Victor took was thick with the scent of decay and burning ozone, an acrid reminder of how far things had gone. His hands clenched at his sides as he and Jonathan stood at the threshold, staring into the heart of the chaos they had helped create. Alice was waiting for them, her presence warping the very air around her. She no longer resembled the woman Victor had once hoped to save. Her form was twisted, grotesque, her limbs elongated unnaturally, her skin an ashen pallor that rippled as if barely containing the force within. Her eyes glowed with an unholy light, and the space around her seemed to pulse with an energy that made the walls tremble. Victor's heart raced, each beat a reminder that the end was near. There was no turning back now. The madness he had unleashed was standing before him, and there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. For a fleeting moment, he thought back to the early days, his bold vision, his dreams of unlocking the mysteries of life and death. How naive it all seemed now. The price of that ambition stood before him in monstrous form, laughing at his arrogance. "Alice," Victor whispered, though he knew it wasn't her anymore. She was gone, and what remained was something else, something far worse. She turned her head toward him, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, predatory gleam. When she spoke, her voice was not the voice of a human. It echoed unnaturally, as if multiple beings spoke through her at once, filling the air with an eerie resonance that made Jonathan recoil. "Victor," she hissed, her lips twisting into a grotesque smile. "You finally came to see the fruits of your labor. Isn't this what you wanted? To defy death? To become a god?" The words cut deep, each one a reminder of his hubris, his obsession. Victor's throat tightened, but he forced himself to stand tall, though his body screamed with the weight of guilt pressing down on him. "You're not her," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Alice is gone." The creature tilted its head, amusement dancing in its burning eyes. "No, Victor," it said mockingly. "You brought me back. This is your doing." Jonathan, standing beside him, couldn't contain his rage any longer. "This isn't life," he shouted, his voice shaking. "Whatever you are, you're a nightmare. Victor never intended for this." Alice's smile grew wider, more menacing. "Intentions? Does that matter now? Your friend here thought he could bend the natural order, and now you both will pay the price." "We can't let this continue," Jonathan said, his voice low, steady, and filled with a grim resolve. "Victor, you know what has to be done." Victor nodded, though his hands trembled. He had known it from the moment Alice had escaped the lab. There was no saving her, no fixing what had been broken. She was beyond redemption. But still, there was a part of him that mourned for what could have been, the life that he had stolen in his pursuit of the impossible. Alice laughed again, her voice crackling with the energy that surged around her. "Do you think you can stop me? You're nothing, Victor. Nothing compared to what I've become." She raised a hand, and the air between them crackled with dark energy, the power distorting the space as if reality itself was bending to her will. Victor took a step back, his breath catching in his throat as the walls around them began to collapse, the structure of the lab groaning under the force. Jonathan grabbed Victor's arm, pulling him away from the danger. "We have to do this now, before she tears the whole place apart." But Victor was frozen, his eyes locked on the monstrous form of Alice. In that moment, all the memories of his work flooded back. Every sleepless night, every experiment, every small victory and crushing failure. He had been so consumed by the idea of conquering death that he had forgotten what it meant to live. He had become so detached from humanity in his quest for power that now, standing face to face with the result of his own folly, he could barely recognize himself. "I'm sorry," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. He wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Alice, to Jonathan, or to the world he had helped to endanger. But he knew one thing for certain: this had to end. Summoning the last reserves of his courage, Victor stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Alice's glowing, hate-filled gaze. "You're right," he said, his voice stronger now. "This is my fault. I created you, and I'll be the one to end it." Before Jonathan could stop him, Victor charged toward Alice, his heart pounding in his chest, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He had no plan, no weapons, nothing but the crushing weight of his guilt and a desperate need to set things right. As he neared her, Alice raised her arms, dark energy swirling around her like a storm. The air crackled with unnatural power, but Victor didn't stop. He lunged forward, grabbing hold of her as the energy pulsed through his body, burning his skin, searing his nerves. He screamed in agony, but he held on. For a moment, the lab was filled with blinding light, a shockwave of raw power tearing through the room as Victor and Alice were engulfed in the storm of energy. Jonathan was thrown back, slamming into the wall with a force that knocked the wind out of him. When the light finally faded, the lab was in ruins. Smoke filled the air, and debris littered the ground. Jonathan struggled to his feet, his ears ringing, his head throbbing from the impact. He staggered forward, scanning the wreckage for any sign of life. In the center of the destruction, where Alice and Victor had stood, there was nothing. The two were gone, consumed by the very forces Victor had unleashed. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of their sacrifice hanging in the air. Jonathan stood there for a long moment, his mind numb from the horror of what had just transpired. The price had been paid, the ultimate price for playing God. But at what cost? As Jonathan left the ruined lab, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost, he knew that the world would never know the true extent of the terror that had unfolded within those walls. But he would remember. He would always remember the day when humanity's arrogance had brought them face to face with forces beyond their control. And in that memory, there was only silence.